The opinions expressed by the host and guests in this show are not necessarily the views of Children's Health Defense.
The governor was in Lancaster County yesterday, came to Women's and Babies Hospital, LGH Penn Medicine Hospital, and made an announcement that there was two individuals who died. I think the terminology was measles associated or something like that, deaths. But the underlying assertion in that was that they died from measles. That certainly was what was communicated in the press. We had, I think it was reported that these were the first measles deaths in the U.S. in 35 years. Alice can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what was reported. So it was a big deal. And I think there is transparency owed around that. There was no information released about the two individuals other than that they were unvaccinated. And the law does allow for information to be released. It can be released without identifying the individuals, but providing some demographic background information, age, that sort of thing. Now, under the law, anyone who dies of a communicable disease in Lancaster County, that means measles in this case, that would have to be reported to the coroner's office. And I spoke at length yesterday with a senior member of the coroner's staff and spoke at length this morning with the coroner himself, and they have 0 cases of measles death. They have one patient, and the coroner spoke about this in the press, but they had one patient who died with measles, not of measles. It's also, if we were in a functioning system, you would have many journalists, rather than just sort of repeating uncritically the line that there were 2 deaths from Lancaster County, they would ask for some corroborating information. You don't get to just say that this happened and then everything else around it is top secret. You need to articulate enough details for people to know, and then for us to be able to communicate with our constituents, and for people to be able to make decisions based on that information.
Good morning, everybody. It is Thursday, August the 27th, 2026, and we are live. I'm going to bring on Karl Jablonowski, our senior scientist at Children's Health Defense, to update us on what is a massive measles mess.
Yeah, that is an accurate statement. What I think it's important to give context. And it is pretty clear that this statement by the governor of Pennsylvania is a direct assault on Secretary of HHS Kennedy. Pretty much every major national news outlet that carried this story evoked him, in probably even including a picture of him. Because he is the political lightning rod for everything measles these days. What is important to know, which you'll never hear from mainstream media, that before Kennedy was against putting mercury in injections that were going into every infant, for which he's labeled an anti-vaxxer, he was against mercury in fish and waterways. Now, somehow that doesn't equate to being branded anti-fish or anti-rivers. He was co-founder and president of the Waterkeeper Alliance for 2 decades and personally took part in restoring the Hudson River. Now, in contrast, in Pennsylvania in 2006, Merck spilled about 25 gallons of potassium thiocyanate from their West Point, Pennsylvania facility, and it poisoned the tributaries of the Delaware River. It contaminated drinking water and killed thousands of fish. The U.S. Department of Justice and the EPA required Merck to pay out $20 million to clean it up. Now, as you can imagine, Merck doesn't want to be on the hook for environmental damages that it causes. So they did what all multi-billion-dollar companies do when they don't like the laws. They lobby. They found a willing candidate in Governor Josh Shapiro, who takes an odd take on environmental protection laws. Essentially, Shapiro believes that they exist to protect big business from having to pay for their environmental damages, and he is rewarded with tens of thousands of dollars from Merck to his campaign. Now, Shapiro is advocating for, which is really fear-mongering, for everyone to be vaccinated with MMR vaccine, which is made by Merck at their West Point facility. He's also a plaintiff in a lawsuit against Secretary Kennedy that alleges that removing individuals with conflicts of interest from ACIP constitutes a violation of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. Now, Governor Shapiro, the man at the podium whose face is plastered all over national news, is up for re-election in 68 days against State Treasurer Stacey Garrity. That is the context on Tuesday's announcement, which reeks of calculated politics. He said very little of substance, and deliberately. He claimed 2 deaths in Lancaster County. What is the utility of that announcement? That they were unvaccinated. It is the same as screaming fire in a crowded movie theater. It's to induce panic. He was not willing to say anything about, were they 9 years old or 99 years old? Were they immunocompromised? Were they pregnant or infants or battling cancer? You don't get to know. Anything, any of those details that you want to know, quote, due to our laws and respect for individual privacy, that information is not going to be released. And I am glad that he brought up Pennsylvania laws, because as the Lancaster County Commissioner Josh Parsons mentioned, it is the law that a death from a communicable disease must be reported to the county coroner. And the Lancaster County coroner, Dr. Stephen Diamatoni, doesn't know what Governor Shapiro is talking about when he mentions 2 deaths from measles. He has not received any information nor found a measles-related death. There was one person who the coroner did identify as having a positive antibody test for measles, and that was in a newborn whose spleen ruptured, probably at delivery. They tested positive for an antibody test for measles. The antibody test is a problematic test. That means that either the fetus itself was infected with measles, which is fairly unlikely, and developed antibodies against it, or the mother was infected with measles and developed antibodies against it and passed those antibodies to the fetus. What is awfully important is that that test is not genotype. That means you don't know where the measles came from. And there are only 2 sources of measles. One is wild type, and the other is the live vaccine. Either one of those could have infected the mother, causing measles antibodies to be present in the newborn. This was not a death from measles.
So, okay, I just want to go back. So, make it absolutely clear this baby, which, by the way, everybody, it's tragic that a baby died. So let's get that one out of the way. I think we all agree that. But this baby did not die of measles, but had an antibody test, which I find really weird. So, a baby died of ruptured spleen, and then they go ahead and test it, an antibody test for measles. Why would you do that?
You might do a full screen if you were concerned for an infection. Even upon discovering that the newborn was positive for antibody measles, the county coroner did not find that it was related to the cause of death. It is still under investigation, but in theory, a measles infection could enlarge the spleen, and an enlarged spleen may rupture during delivery. That is all theory. the spleen was not observed to have been enlarged. But the county coroner's, at least conclusion for now, is that it is completely unrelated to the cause of death. And thereby, what's the utility of saying death from measles in something that the county coroner himself says not related?
Okay, I am really concerned going forward that anybody who's had the MMR could get in a car wreck or whatever, be in hospital for whatever reason, and they die, and then they do an antibody test or whatever, and they have measles because they've had the MMR, as in active in the gut. I mean, I'm not a scientist, so maybe put this right. Do you see where I'm going with this? They could say this a lot going forward.
That is correct. If you are vaccinated, you are essentially being infected with strain A measles. It is a live vaccine. Your body will create antibodies against that virus that comes from the vaccine. If you were to, probe most of America would have antibodies for measles.
So, okay, so I think we've got to call that out, because if I was the dark side, that's the way I would go. Measles everywhere. Everybody's dying of measles, when in fact, it's just as you spoke. Okay, so summarizing this up, we don't know anything about the other case of measles at all, even if it exists.
No, we know absolutely nothing about this second cause of death. And it's not just us who don't know it. It's, the county coroner of Lancaster who ought to know it. The CDC, who requested information and was denied by the state of Pennsylvania. The CDC ought to know if there was a death from measles in the country. And, the CDC doesn't even get that right. They have still labeled Kaylee Fair and Daisy Hildebrand as deaths from measles, where in fact we know, looking through their medical records, that they died from medical malpractice. The last case of a pediatric death from measles occurred, I believe it was in 2003, from a teenager who underwent a bone marrow transplant and were severely immune compromised. 3 months later, developed and died from measles encephalitis, and measles virus was isolated in a brain biopsy. That is what measles death looks like. And if you want to go, find someone who died from measles before then, who was not immunocompromised, you would probably have to go back to the 1990s.
Okay, so Governor Shapiro is heavily compromised. He is massive conflict of interest, being paid for getting money from Merck, and is up for re-election. So thinks, this is my take on it, thinks this is a great opportunity because I'm up for re-election to be the good guy. So this has fallen badly for him. The press take from this press conference with Shapiro, the press go crazy, as they always do. Everyone get your MMR, measles death, fire, Bob, calling for Secretary Kennedy to be got rid of. And so from then, the coroner says, actually, there are no measles. We've had no measles deaths coming in here. So expose it. Kennedy jumps on that and says, I don't even know if any of these measles exist. So what a mess.
Yes, and I do mean it looks politically calculated to be a mess. Most of this country has received a measles vaccine. We are pouring this measles fear mongering through our media. It's going to induce the vaccinated to blame the unvaccinated. And Shapiro planting his flag squarely in the vaccine camp is going to be alienating the, tiny fraction who, through the practice of medical freedom, choose not to be vaccinated. And he's just going to be solidifying his base. And he could get away with it unless people call him out and say, realistically, what measles deaths?
Right. And it seems to me, having spoken to Brian Hooker the other day, it seems to me that the unvaccinated are the ones that have stronger immune systems and are able to cope with the measles. And it seems to me that the vaccinated are the ones that, if anything, spreading the measles. And by the way, if you've had the MMR, after the discussion we just had, be very careful that you're not ending up in hospital and die, because they will say you are active measles or antibody test. That's the way it's going, I think. But we will keep you updated, viewers. Make sure you're signed up to the Defender and to get the Defender news, because they will be breaking stuff this evening as well. We will be back on tomorrow morning with, I think, either Karl or Brian Hooker. And also, just so you know, right now we are streaming the IAC. And I think you, Karl, are going to hop back over there and start live blogging for that. So do tune into that. We are going to go to Meryl Nass, Dr. Meryl Nass now as well. But keep up to date. Watch us on social media as well. We'll break news as it happens. But it seems to me this has been an awful mess. I'm very grateful to you, Karl, and Brian Hooker and your team in the science department for being on top of this and bringing us the truth. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Polly.
All right, we're going to Meryl Nass, Dr. Nass now.
Good morning, CHD. I'm doing something quite different than usual, something maybe that the lawyers, Mary Holland and King Mack Rosenberg might be doing, but I'm going to talk with Kim about my own legal case. So 7 days ago, I received an unexpected order from the chief judge of the District of Maine in federal court. Just to recap, the Maine board, so in every state, medical practice and many other practices, from hairdressers to whatever, barbers and, horseshoers, everybody has their own board. And these boards are supposed to provide peer review so that everybody has, so that the public has some way that professionals are being reviewed to make sure that they practice within the spectrum that they are supposed to. And so for doctors, you, of course, have to pass tests. You have to do a residency. In Maine, you need an actual meeting with doctors, and then they issue you a license, which you can ordinarily renew every 2 years. You have to do 50 hours a year of continuing education. And if you don't do anything wrong, that's what happens, and you never really have to think about the medical board. In my case, the medical board got interested in me suddenly during COVID in late 2021. First one person and then another reported me to the board. And both of them said, we don't know her. We don't know any of her patients. We know nothing about her medical practice, but we saw something on the internet that we thought should be brought to your attention, because there was this story, if you see something, say something. So they saw something on the internet, and it's unclear whether these were just two random people. One of them had a daughter who was a doctor and had been taking photos at demonstrations in Portland and probably was some kind of agent. The other one was a therapist who, oddly, when the board reached out to her, because she was from my town, and the board said, well, what do you know? Do you know any of her patients? They wanted to find patients that they could get complaints from, because complaints from strangers weren't good enough, since their job is to protect patients, not really to monitor what I do online. And so she told them she didn't know any patients. And when they said, well, where can we find these statements? She said, Google her. She didn't even know what the statements were that she was complaining about. So anyway, those two people complained, and that was the justification for the board to start a file on me. And then they asked me to respond to these complaints. And I said, well, what's the complaint? What did I do wrong? And by the way, where do you have the authority to monitor my private life? So, luckily, because I had worked on anthrax vaccine cases years before, I knew a little bit about the law, but not much. So There was a back and forth, but the board was starting to build a case against me. And so it was unusual because they were building a case based on nothing that I did to take care of patients, which is not what they're supposed to do. Now, there's board members and there's board staff. So in the beginning, this is all board staff, which included several lawyers and doctors, by the way. So they collected a lot of information. They knew that I had spoken to the pharmacology board in Maine and begged them not to scare doctors, not to tell doctors they were not allowed to use ivermectin for COVID. They had gone into other things that I had done. In any event, they told me they told me in December. This all started in October, and it went very fast. So by December, they said, we're going to have a meeting, come to the meeting with your lawyer. You won't be able to speak, but you'll be able to hear us. And quickly I had to get a lawyer. My malpractice insurance gave me a lawyer who didn't really like me and quit the night before the meeting with the board. So I had no lawyer, went to the meeting with the board, and they said, you can't talk, you can't record, you can't, we're gonna have a closed session about you. But but it's against the law to record it. Well, I had already bought the night before a little audio recorder, and I'd been recording the rest of the meeting, and I didn't turn it off, knowing that in Maine, for phone calls, if one person on a phone call knows that it's being recorded, that's good enough. So I left my recorder on, and which fortunately recorded the whole conversation that the board had. And that conversation was all about my speech. We don't like her speech. We don't like her opinions. They're dangerous. What can we say about her? How can we go after her? What is our justification? And so then they started batting around different psychological diagnoses that maybe they could apply to me, and they couldn't really come up with a good one. So they finally came up with attention seeking, which is not really a psychiatric diagnosis. And then they told me that they were immediately suspending my license because I was a danger to the public, and that I would get and here they gave me an appointment, which they'd already made. So they'd already made their decision before they had a meeting about me. So, which is odd because the members presumably had never heard about me before that meeting, but somebody had made a decision before the meeting because they already had a typed up form to give me saying they were suspending my license and that I had to go for a neuropsychological examination with a psychologist. They had already made the appointment. The appointment was to be in 2 or 3 weeks' time. And they told me to bring $2,100 to the appointment to pay for it. And then they told me I would have 24 hours to decide whether to turn in my medical license or not. And if I didn't turn it in, I would then have to go through a hearing. I didn't really know what to do. I desperately started looking for lawyers, and eventually, and then I got COVID. So I was planning to go to that psychological visit because I thought surely they're not going to be able to charge me with some psychiatric crime. I mean, I'm pretty sane. I don't take any psych medicines. I never have. I've never been to a psychiatrist. I didn't think I don't have any substance abuse issues, but apparently, since they had already made the appointment, they had picked out the psychologist. They must have already picked out what that person was going to do. They'd already picked out how I was going to be punished before the meeting. I wound up getting COVID, so I could not go to that appointment. I had to cancel it. And then they made me another appointment for about a month later. And by the time that second appointment came along, I had gotten some lawyers, and they told me, no, you don't go to the appointment. This just gives them an excuse of how to go after you. They find something. And so they filed a lawsuit to challenge the board about that psychological appointment. And I never did go. Then eventually, after a lot of delays, we had the hearing, and the hearing was basically one day a month, and it lasted for 8 days, and each day was separated usually by a month or two. So it took 11 months to get through the hearing. And then the board found me. So in the middle, so as we approached, the whole thing took about 3 years. And as we approached the hearing, the attorneys for the board, who are assistant attorney generals for the state of Maine, changed the crimes that I was being accused of. So the first set of crimes was all about my speech, that I'd said this and I'd said that and I'd said something else, and they didn't like it. But as time went on, they realized that they could be charged with a First Amendment violation, because there is something called free speech in our system. It's the First Amendment of the Constitution. So they dropped those charges, and then they were still interested in getting me for off-label prescribing of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. At this point, they were going after my charts. So they had found they managed to derive complaints from a nurse practitioner, actually a nurse midwife in one case, who had treated her patient for COVID, and another patient of mine who wound up in the hospital, and the doctor in the hospital, I think maybe the ER doctor or the hospitalist, had filed a complaint that I had treated this patient with ivermectin. And then the third patient was somebody I had reported to the board that I had treated. I had treated him with hydroxychloroquine and earlier with ivermectin. And the pharmacist where I had prescribed the hydroxychloroquine refused to dispense it unless I told him the diagnosis. And the reason was that the health department in Maine, even though I'm not sure this is legal, I don't think it is, the health department had told all the pharmacists that they had to get the name of the diagnosis on a prescription pad, which of course goes against HIPAA. It's a privacy violation. But if the prescription was intended for COVID, they were told not to dispense it. And again, I don't think there was they had a legal justification for that. I think the health department was going against the law. There was no rule or law that would allow them to issue that. And so not all the pharmacists obeyed them. Some of them were continuing to dispense hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin for COVID, but they were few and far between, because the others were all worried about their license, or they worked for a chain pharmacy, and the chain had issued orders to their pharmacists not to dispense those drugs for COVID. So anyway, when the pharmacist called me and said, I need a diagnosis, I knew that if I gave him the right diagnosis, the patient would not get the medicine, and the patient was very fragile. I was afraid he would be, he could potentially die. And he, in fact, was hospitalized and then put on a ventilator. So my understanding of the patient's risk was correct. I called the pharmacist and I said, look, I'm prescribing this for Lyme disease. And so he issued the prescription. And, 5 minutes later, I emailed the board and I said, look what you made me do. This is not good. You cannot force doctors to lie to pharmacists in order to get what is potentially a life-saving medication. My concern is the patient first, not whether I'm telling a white lie to a pharmacist, and you have to stop doing this. And of course, that probably, they weren't happy about that, but they thought, wow, we can use this against her. She's told a lie to a pharmacist and she's admitted it. And so they made that patient one of the patients that I then had to. So eventually, by the third go round of making a list of charges against me, they were able to come up with charges about these 3 patients, and my prescribing and my white lie. And my charts weren't complete enough for one thing and another. They came up with some fiddly little small things. And that was what the hearing was about, because they had realized that prescribing ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine was actually legal. I was well within my rights to do that. But they made a big deal about, see, she's a doctor who told a lie to a pharmacist to get a drug, as if I was, getting a narcotic for myself or for my family member, or something like that. That was the impression they wanted to give. And in fact, a doctor, a surgeon on the board, accused me of running a pill mill, equivalent to a narcotics pill mill. anyway, and accused me of giving the same drug and not paying any attention to the patients, which was a lie because each one of the 3 patients that was at issue in this board hearing, I had prescribed a different group of medications or single medication too. So they didn't all get the same thing. I spent, at least a half an hour with every patient going over their medical history, their other drugs, their allergies, their, everything else. But the board wanted to paint me as a negligent physician. So anyway, that happened. Then even though through the testimony, I think there was a lot of testimony that cleared my name, the board, its lawyers, and the person who acted as judge, who was an administrative judge. They all, the members of the board all found me guilty of a bunch of charges and continued to suspend my medical license, which had already been suspended for 3 years, and they extended that suspension for 3 more years, and gave me a lot of hoops to jump through in order to get my license back, which included sending them my charts and having a practice monitor. And what that meant was I would not be able to practice independently. If there were another COVID or another pandemic, I would have to prescribe the drugs that they wanted me to prescribe and not what I felt was in the best interests of my patients. So for that reason, I made no attempt to get my license back. And we sued the board for various things they had done to me. And that case has been taking years. And then sort of out of the blue, we got a ruling last week that that much of that case was thrown out, which means we were not allowed to sue the board for many of the charges. But the judge made a very favorable order pointing out that the decision to subject me to a psychological examination was arbitrary and capricious, according not only to him, but to an earlier judge, that they had no business doing that. And so that I could sue them in their the members of the board in their personal capacity for that, and potentially also for the suspension of my license and for abridging the Maine civil rights law. So that's where we stand now. We've been given the right to sue the members of the medical board in their personal capacity for having gone way beyond their mission, which is to protect the patients of Maine. So we're not being allowed to argue about the decision they made after the hearing, but we are being allowed to argue what they did before the hearing even started. And that's where we are. Now, maybe you can contextualize that, Kim, and talk about other cases as well.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And Meryl, you have been through the ringer for years now over this. And I think that one of the key issues here is what they're doing to try to stop physicians and other medical professionals from speaking out and sharing their opinions when those opinions go against what the government believes your opinion should be or what the quote unquote standard of care should be for treatment. And, even by subjecting you on this, very sort of knee-jerk reaction that we're going to send you for a psychological evaluation, that even carries with it, to me, the suggestion, just by requiring that there is something wrong with you, and therefore that, what you're talking about when you're talking about ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, if there's something psychologically wrong with you, obviously those opinions are not valid and not valuable. But really what those opinions did was contradict what the state wanted people to talk about, what the board wanted people to talk about, which drugs should be prescribed to people, right? It was all kind of a setup to control your speech. And we saw that so many doctors faced, if not the same situation, a similar situation during COVID, and sometimes, in other situations as well. There was a case that we brought, CHD was a named plaintiff, and we supported on behalf of CHD, some other organizational plaintiffs, and individual medical practitioners in California. When California passed, I believe the bill was SB 2098, which directly said that you cannot talk about alternative treatments for COVID. Here's what the standard of care is. And we know, it's remdesivir and ventilators and all those things that had such damaging effects on people. But if you want to talk about ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, we've got a law to prosecute you under. So we brought a case where we asked the court, Judge Shub in the Eastern District of California, I believe, and asked him to issue a preliminary injunction stopping that law from going into effect because it was a dangerous attempt to tamp down free speech. And Judge Shub agreed with us, and he issued the preliminary injunction. And then about a year or so later, California repealed that law. So that was a big win, right? We repealed the law that says you can't talk about these things. It never really went into effect, and then it was repealed. So that's a win. But then California went ahead and took their general standard of care laws and regulations and started to apply it to the same speech. So we went in and said, Judge Shub, this is the same thing. They're just using a different law to do it. And he found that we weren't entitled to an injunction in that case because this was a much more general law. It impacted the standard of care. We're talking about treatment of patients. There were any number of reasons. We took it up to the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit agreed with the Eastern District of California. We filed a petition for certiorari to the U.S. Supreme Court, and we filed that in the 24-25 SCOTUS calendar year. And, they review petitions at various points during their session, during their term. And we kept waiting to hear what they were doing with the case that was known as Kory v. Bonta. Rob Bonta is the Attorney General of the state of California. So we're waiting and waiting, and June comes around. And by the time you get to the end of June, they're really tying up their term. And we still have no decision on Kory v. Bonta. The court looks at several thousand petitions for writ of certiorari in any given term. They grant less than 1% of them usually. And that controls what they're, those that they grant are the ones that they hear, that they have argument on. And they're the cases that we hear about coming out. So we're waiting and we hear nothing. And basically the term ends. And Kory v. Bonta is the only case that doesn't have a decision, yes or no, on whether the court's going to hear it. But what we know then is that the court has decided that it's going to hear argument in a case that CHD was not involved in called Chiles against Salazar. And Chiles against Salazar was a case involving a Colorado law that did not allow practitioners to talk about conversion therapy. And what the law basically did, and this was brought by a talk therapist in Colorado who said this was chilling her speech so that someone could they could affirm someone's gender identity, but they couldn't talk about things that did not involve affirming gender identity, right? So the opposite of affirming gender identity, and maybe having discussions about other options, other choices, in the professional therapy relationship, having these discussions. So Ms. Chiles brought this case, the Supreme Court took it up and issued, and we thought, well, maybe this means when they have the Chiles decision, we'll get a decision in Kory v. Bonta too. We didn't. But the Chiles decision came down and very strongly came down against the Colorado law as it was applied to Ms. Chiles. It said not only is it controlling the content of speech and what topics were allowed to be spoken about, so it's regulating the context of speech, but it also was applying what's called the viewpoint discrimination. So one viewpoint is acceptable, another viewpoint is not. This sounds a whole lot like Kory v. Bonta. This sounds a whole lot like what happened to you. And they said that is not acceptable. And just because you're a doctor and there's this idea of standard of care, that doesn't make viewpoint discrimination acceptable either. And in fact, states those laws have to be subject to strict scrutiny, the highest level of scrutiny by a court. And it's very difficult to think of a situation where viewpoint discrimination by a government is okay. And in fact, it's really important the Supreme Court recognized that we have this exchange of ideas. That's why we have the First Amendment, right? We don't have the First Amendment to protect the easy things that we talk about. We have the First Amendment to protect difficult content, difficult topics, difficult viewpoints that maybe people find challenging to have out in the marketplace. But that's why we have the First Amendment. So Chiles comes down. It's a great decision, came down, I believe, end of March, beginning of April of this year. And then the court denied our petition for cert in Kory v. Bonta. So people thought, well, maybe that case is over, but it wasn't. We went back to the Eastern District of California, to the same judge, and said, Your Honor, the Supreme Court just decided Chiles. They decided also another First Amendment related law, which is First Choice against Davenport. And these cases show that we're entitled to a preliminary injunction here because they're trying to do the same thing. This is viewpoint discrimination. It's causing doctors to self-censor, right? They're either going to give up their California licenses or they're not going to talk about things that they believe are important for their patients and the public to hear about. And based on those two Supreme Court opinions, the judge essentially reversed himself on the denial of a preliminary injunction, granting a preliminary injunction saying you can't use standard of care here to control speech either. So that was a big win. That just came down very recently. And in fact, it came down beginning of August. So it's a brand new decision. And your decision essentially says the same thing. You can't do this to people. You can't do this to doctors. It's important that doctors be able to have conversations, as you said, with your patients about what treatments may be best for your patients. And they did put you in a position where, in order to get patients the treatment that would help them, you had to tell a white lie to a pharmacist. And that's not a comfortable position, I'm sure, for you as a physician to be in. But your obligation, as you said, is to your patients first.
Right.
And I mean, that's the oath you take as a doctor. So these cases, Chiles and First Choice, Kory, your case, I think are showing a willingness now, and I don't know that it'll be, a sweeping tide, but having the Supreme Court decisions in particular is very important and very helpful. And the Chiles decision has great language in it about protecting the speech of physicians, other medical professionals. They say, these the First Amendment protections extend to licensed professionals as much as they do to everybody else. You don't give them less protection because they're a medical doctor and there's some standard of care. And you also don't turn speech into treatment. Speech isn't necessarily treatment. Can you have a standard of care regulation or law that impacts, treatment that you give patients? We can talk about that, but this isn't treatment. This is speech. And particularly where you're trying to control the viewpoint, trying to control the content, those kinds of laws are presumptively unconstitutional.
Yes. And thank goodness the Supreme Court realized that, and maybe it had to take this long after COVID.
Well, I think that's part of it, right? They're seeing, and the Chiles case had nothing to do with COVID at all, which is helpful, I think, on a bigger scale too, because COVID was COVID. Could it happen again? Could something similar happen again with another illness? Could there be some other type of crisis where we say, oh, we don't want doctors talking about that? I mean, there was really I've said this a number of times at various different events that I've spoken at. It is such a disservice, was such a disservice to the American public to have the government using social media platforms and others control the narrative of what, how you treat this disease, what this disease can do, what the trajectory of the disease is. People didn't know what they didn't know, right? They saw the FDA saying that, ivermectin is horse medicine and we shouldn't, we're not horses, we're people, we shouldn't take it. You had to look and know to look for a differing viewpoint to understand all the options that were out there. And then you make a decision that, along with your treating physician, you make a decision that's right for you as an individual patient. But if you don't know and your doctor's not allowed to tell you, how are you supposed to make an informed decision? I mean, it really goes to the heart of informed consent.
Yeah. But even beyond that, or in addition to, patients are different. The one drug is not the be all and end all for every single patient on the planet, and an attempt or vaccine. And so for the government to say, look, this is how it's going to be done, if you wind up in the hospital, you get remdesivir, and if you want to protect yourself and you want to keep your job or you want to go to school, you have to take this vaccine. I mean, that is it's, we didn't say it at the time, but on its face, it's crazy, because everybody has a different profile of risks and benefits from a treatment or a prophylactic vaccine. And so the role of the doctor is to formulate that equation with the patient. What are the risks? What are the benefits? Which way do we go? Is there another strategy to help protect you? And basically, if you don't use a doctor for that purpose, which is our only job, you might as well not have doctors. Everybody could just go to a computer and get a prescription for a COVID shot, and for remdesivir and be done with it. So it was really, it was an attack on the patients, but it was an attack on the entire enterprise of medicine. And the fact that it was led by doctors is very concerning, by our top public health doctors in the United States. We realize that they were not chosen because of their expertise, their ethics, their knowledge, but they were chosen because they would go along to get along. They would perform as actors or puppets. And that when they had the lives of 340 million Americans in their hands, they did not weigh that responsibility with much depth or care.
And that trickled down right to individual doctors and to hospitals and the protocols, the hospital protocols that were put in place. I personally know someone who was an elderly woman who had, she was a kidney transplant patient many years ago, successful transplant patient. When she was hospitalized with COVID, they put her on remdesivir. And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a clinician, is that should be a contraindication for remdesivir under any circumstance, right? But because it was the hospital protocol, this woman was put on remdesivir and she passed away. I mean, similarly, I'm highly allergic to doxycycline. And oftentimes ivermectin and doxycycline were prescribed together. You talked about how important it is to sit down with a patient and talk to them and figure out which single drug or which combination of drugs may be appropriate to prescribe for them. For me, if someone prescribed, I open my mouth and tell people I'm allergic to doxycycline because I'm allergic to most antibiotics, that something else has to be done for me. You can't just say, well, even, using that crazy ivermectin, the standard doxycycline ivermectin combination wouldn't work for me as an individual patient, right? So I shouldn't be out there, especially if I don't know what I'm allergic to, self-prescribing these things. I should be working in conjunction with, a medical professional who's taking my medical history and knows what will work or what won't work. for me. Because
Yeah.
you're right. Otherwise, we can just sit down and, we can all ask any of the AI platforms that we know what we should take for something, and it'll spew something out. And I think, we're seeing more and more. I don't know if you've followed the Lindsay Clancy trial at all, this mother who's been accused of killing her 3 children. She was prescribed, I think, more than a dozen SSRIs and antipsychotics over a very short period of time. And she kept saying she wasn't feeling well, but that over prescribing of medications like that, and just prescribing one thing on top of another. X isn't working, and we see it on the pharmaceutical advertising too, right? Oh, is your antidepressant not really covering all the bases for you? Well, then we've got this, not that we're going to change, we're not going to take you off that one, but we'll layer something else on.
Right. Or we'll double the dose, or we'll quadruple the dose. When there's, no justification for that, where the label does not allow for those doses, so now doctors can do that. You can prescribe off-label, you can prescribe outside the recommended dose range. That's off-label prescribing, but it is your responsibility to explain to the patient what you're doing and why you're doing it, and to have them agree. If you decide to go outside, I mean, SSRIs are well documented to have been involved in many, many, many suicides and homicides, and they're worth a lot of money, so the industry keeps fighting back. But they are a very dangerous class of drugs. They have a black box warning. They're not supposed to, which means doctors are at risk if they prescribe it, if something happens to the patient, or if the patient tells you, I'm not doing well on this drug, or I'm having suicidal thoughts, it behooves the doctor to get them off that medicine immediately, because that black box warning even puts the doctor, at more risk of a malpractice suit, because they've been warned this is a dangerous drug. So it isn't used in adolescents pretty much anymore, because there were so many adolescents who had suicidal thoughts, or attempted suicide, or successfully killed themselves on these drugs.
I think you brought up an important point too, because I do think this played a role in the use of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and other sort of, I don't know if the proper term is legacy drugs, but those drugs have been, they're old school drugs, right? They've been around for a really long time. They are, I believe, off patent, so they're inexpensive. Remdesivir, on the other hand, costs a small fortune, and there are people, who I know, because I know this happened to someone I know personally. This person was prescribed remdesivir for something. It's an expensive drug. I think it's made by Gilead. Is that right?
Yes.
They were making a fortune off of it. The people who, there were government players who were involved in, as is often the case, people don't realize with many drugs and vaccines, there is a role that the government has played in the development of that, and they actually hold the license and license it back to the pharmaceutical. So the government is making a lot of money off of that. A lot of people are unaware of that, but you can look on the NIH website and see how much money various drugs and pharmaceuticals and medical devices bring in for the US government. But there was not a lot of money to be made on hydroxychloroquine and on ivermectin.
Yes.
And so these financial interests, I think, come into play as well. And that's one of the reasons why people didn't want people taking ivermectin, because it cost pennies, versus remdesivir.
Yes. I think, Fauci leading NIAID is the example for this. Bobby Kennedy said years ago that he turned NIAID into a drug incubator for industry. And I had no idea. When Bobby said that, I thought, what is he really talking about? But when COVID happened and I started looking into it, I found that was the case, that under Fauci, most of the grants were given to develop new drugs. And in many cases, the government would have or within NIH itself, the NIH employees were encouraged to develop new drugs or new ways of using drugs, and then would try to license them to industry. And anyway, as a result of that, the NIAID sued Moderna because they didn't feel like they got enough royalties from them, and got $400 million a couple of years ago. They also, because NIAID had actually developed a part of the spike protein. I won't go into the details, but they had patented this part and licensed it out. So they were getting royalties also from Pfizer. The Fort Detrick, the government's biodefense center, had been testing remdesivir on primates. And NIH had paid for a lot of the development of remdesivir. Now, I'm not sure that whether they're getting royalties or not. The way it works is any scientists whose name is on the patent who work for the government can get up to $150,000 a year in royalties. But anything additional to that, and with these COVID vaccines, it's hundreds of millions of dollars more, that money went to NIH or NIAID. So Fauci, and the kicker, there didn't have to be any reporting to Congress. NIAID and its boss, its mafiosi chief, Tony Fauci, could spend that money any way he wanted with no reporting to anybody. And so now it starts making a lot more sense when you say, why did NIAID make such an effort to force remdesivir, and these vaccines down our throats? It was because essentially, the bottom line is they were getting kickbacks. And this is the state of modern American medicine right now. And the laws that enable this must be changed.
Well, and, going back to the speech issue, right? That's part of the reason they don't want you to talk about these other medications, right? I mean,
Yes.
we follow the money trail. And as a result, as we both know, and CHD has reported on extensively, you've spoken about it, people suffered and died as a result, where they could have been treated. And, the fact that, this whole case against you really ultimately had nothing to do with how your patients were treated or how your patients fared. This wasn't based on patient complaints. This was an attempt to silence you from talking about medications, protocols that the government was not endorsing. And you're not talking about what the government is endorsing, or you're talking about it in a way that does not encourage people to maybe necessarily go seek out those treatments, but you're sharing information that is so important for patients to have and for the public to have in making personalized medical care decisions, because ultimately there's nothing that has the same effect on two different people, right? Even allergy medication or an aspirin, something can have a different effect on different people.
Absolutely. Every drug, any drug has the potential to kill you if you're the right person and the right, So this is why you need a relationship with your doctor, so that there's somebody to call. If you're having a peculiar reaction in the middle of the night or the weekend, you need somebody to call and say, this is what's happening. What do I do? A friend of mine just actually 2 days ago told me she was taking Cipro and she had broken out in a rash, but she still had another day of Cipro to go. And I said, stop it immediately. She's like, oh, no, but I have another day. I was like, no, you can make the allergic reaction much worse. You don't want to have anaphylaxis next.
Right.
And so it's really important that we not rely on computers, and federal authorities to tell us that everybody needs to be treated X way, and it doesn't matter what happens. The patient, so I had 3 patients that the board talked about, that charged me with mistreating. All 3 of them, none of them had been interviewed by the board until we got into the middle of the hearing. So they had made these judgments before hearing from them or reviewing their charts. And all of them said I had done a good job. The one patient who wound up with remdesivir had a kidney problem and came into the hospital. He didn't want to go to the hospital. I had told him he had to go. He finally went. He had delayed overnight, and they blamed me for that, as if I had told him to wait until tomorrow, which I hadn't. I told him to go to the emergency room at night. He came with a piece of paper saying, I don't want remdesivir. And they gave him remdesivir anyway, and his kidney function worsened. And so then they waited a day or two until his kidney function came back to baseline, and then they gave him some more. And I was talking to his doctor at the time, please don't do this. And it didn't matter. It didn't matter what his doctor said. It didn't matter what the piece of paper that the patient had signed said. Everybody was sort of walking in lockstep. If the government tells me to do this, I'm doing this. And like I said, we must never let this happen again.
Mhm.
So first I had the board making a decision on my case, and they all, voted unanimously that I was a terrible person. And then we appealed, and so the judge in that case retired without without issuing a decision. And so they pushed in another judge. I think he thought I was too much of a hot potato, and he didn't want to rule either way. Because I was very, my case was very political. The governor was involved, et cetera. So they
Mhm.
got another judge, and the other judge basically ignored all the testimony and just repeated what there were two witnesses for the other side. This one was a guy named Dr. Faust, Jeremy Faust, who is the editor-in-chief of MedPage Today, who is a conductor of a musical choir, and once in a while works in the emergency room. Now, he was willing for $500 an hour to tell the board whatever they wanted, except he was illegally hired, because there is a booklet for if you're hiring an expert witness for the medical board, these are the criteria. And he was required to be licensed in Maine, but he wasn't. He was required to be in my field, which is internal medicine, but he wasn't. And he was required to be paid no more than $175 an hour, but he wasn't. And yet all of that was ignored, and his testimony was and the judge referred to him as the COVID expert. He's not a COVID expert. He's an editor,
Mhm.
who occasionally works in an ER. They actually did have an infectious disease doctor, but the infectious disease doctor, who was the board's witness, said that my charts were fine and I had treated the patients appropriately. So they didn't want to use his testimony. And then they did not refer to the testimony of either the three patients or my four expert witnesses. So that was how the original case got decided on appeal. And then, my attorneys said, you're not going to get anywhere if you try to appeal this. This is just how the system is. And I did not understand that. I didn't understand that reasoning, but I went along with them. And so we didn't appeal it. And so anyway, now that we're suing the board members, it turns out that because I didn't appeal that last ruling, I cannot challenge the board on anything that happened during the hearing or anything that was decided in that case. But because this small window of time before there was any hearing, when they were just on January 11th deciding to take away my license and send me to a psychologist, that is what we are allowed to dispute. And so that is what we're disputing. And I hope that explains things. What more should we be telling the audience, Kim?
Well, I think that first I'm going to go correct myself because I figured out what was going on. My friend that I mentioned does have autoimmune conditions, but had a series of severe viral infections, which is why they were taking remdesivir, but found that text thread. I think we've had a great conversation to sort of help people understand how all of these cases, your case, the Kory case, the Chiles case, how all of these play into patient care, doctors' ability to share what they want to share with their patients, right? I read an op-ed years and years ago in one of the major medical journals that talked about, it was written by a doctor, and they were saying that it's very depressing. It was very depressing for this doctor to be a doctor because everything had turned into the business of medicine, not the practice of medicine. And they were in a big HMO system where things are, highly regulated by the HMO and what you can say and what you can do and how long you can talk to a patient. That is not the way you practiced medicine at all. And, and I think a lot of doctors are having regrets now about selling out to those big systems or going to work within those systems. Not everyone, I can't paint everyone with a broad brushstroke. But I think patients need to understand that they need to advocate for themselves, but they need to talk to their doctors. And they need to have doctors who can speak freely with them to share the information that is going to impact their treatment and obtain the right treatment for them, not what the right treatment supposedly is for 340 million Americans, right? Because it's not the right treatment for everyone. And we even saw that in the American Academy of Pediatrics case against Secretary Kennedy up in the District Court of Massachusetts, and now it's on appeal to the First Circuit, where they sought and obtained from the district court a preliminary injunction, among other things, stopping the ACIP recommendations that many of the vaccines move to shared decision-making. And we have the executive order from the 10th of this month, which addresses a lot of those issues. And we could spend a whole hour talking about that. But they got the preliminary injunction, and one of the things they put into place, because you're supposed to show irreparable harm, one of the things they did was they brought in these declarations from doctors who said, I only have so much time with each patient. If I have to sit down with a patient or patient's parents and talk about vaccines, they're going to be asking me questions. It's going to take a lot of time. I won't be able to see as many patients, and I won't make as much money. Again, it's following the money trail. And it also tells me that for the doctors, certainly who put in the declarations, they're not having those conversations with their patients. And what else aren't they having conversations with their patients about, right? If they have 8 minutes to talk to a patient, or some people have told me their doctor has 6 minutes or 13 minutes, it's not a lot of time. Patients need to stand up for themselves and ask for those conversations, and hopefully have a doctor who's willing to have those conversations with them. But in order to do that, doctors have to be protected from the state coming in and exercising what is essentially viewpoint discrimination, which, as the Chiles court points out, is unconstitutional to say what you can and can't say. And doctors shouldn't be treated any differently than me as a lawyer, or someone as a plumber, or a hairstylist, talking about whatever they want to talk about, right? Are we going to now say hairstylists, which you mentioned, they're licensed professionals, I think in every state, you can only talk about X, Y, and Z with your clients. You can't talk about A, B, and C. You can't do that. And you can't do that to doctors either.
It's going to take more, though, probably than a case or two, because these large HMO, these large medical industries that now employ 78% of doctors, they are not going to allow, they might not say you're not allowed to say this, that, or the other, but if they only give you 8 minutes per patient, there's no way you can talk about things. And so, the federal government has no ability to tell a medical company how long a doctor spends with a patient.
Right.
But, we have to realize that the system needs to be overturned on so many levels.
Oh, it does, right? The system, absolutely. The medical system in this country does not function well, and it does not function to the benefit, in many instances, of the patients or the treating medical professionals.
Doctors,
yeah,
right.
yeah. It's a broken system, and I know there are attempts to work from outside the system to create new systems and attempts to work within, but it is a big, heavy lift. It's a
Yes.
heavy lift.
Yes. Exactly. And we have to be, we have to think clearly about who we choose to be our doctor. Because, for minor illnesses, it doesn't matter. But when you face something like COVID again, you need the person that you can rely on to be there only for you, the way they took an oath to do long time ago. You have to be number one. No matter what the consequences are. Didn't think the consequences would be this bad for me, but I knew they might. I also knew I was old. I knew I wasn't going to go hungry if I lost my license or my job. I was surprised that so many people thought I must have done something terrible to have this happen to me. I was surprised that I lost friends and lost patients. So it was, it was a very bad blow to me reputationally. I used to be a consultant. Obviously nobody's asked me to consult on anything since this happened. But it was all worth it. It was worth it in the end. And I so appreciate CHD for giving me the opportunities to talk about this and to do what I can to make things better in the future. Getting a really clear eye on what happened is necessary to figure out what needs to be fixed. And so we know a lot more about that now. And
we absolutely do. And you still have, thanks to Judge Walker's order, you have this opportunity to, as you said, it's narrow, but it's narrow and important.
yes,
What still gets to move forward in your case.
because unfortunately, usually the only thing that stops people in positions of power, like board members, is to know that they actually could be found liable for their thoughtless actions. I'm not the only doctor whose career was ruined over something stupid. And this will make boards throughout the country and maybe the world think twice if they decide to go after someone on very, very shaky grounds. If they want to take the thin ice approach and try to, make me look like I am somebody I'm not. And, they deliver. Not only did they do this to me, but then they must have sent out press releases. So it went to, a doctor having their license suspended for misinformation should not be national news. It should be a very minor thing happening in one corner of the country. And yet suddenly I'm in the national news. The Associated Press is running articles everywhere about this. And the whole purpose of that was so that doctors around the country would know about it. The same Jeremy Faust, who was the expert witness against me, his MedPage Today ran a big article about me the day after the board suspended my license and sent me for the psychological exam. He was basically in cahoots with the board, spreading this information out. So MedPage Today it's an online free magazine going to doctors around the country. And that was the audience they were looking for. And Jeremy Faust, the witness against me, who had no idea what he was paid for his other jobs, who couldn't, he was a terrible witness. But I know he's going to get his just desserts at some point, and I don't need to give them to him. But I will always wonder why these judges and board members were willing to hire this person who didn't meet any of the criteria and who was clearly, a hired gun who would say anything for money. Why did they go along with that? Why did they go along with everything when it was so clearly wrong? I guess everybody felt they would never be touched, and now maybe they will be. So I'm hoping for justice, and I will just plow through this, and
we have
what happens.
14 days from the date of the decision for the Attorney General's office to decide whether they're going to appeal Judge Walker's order. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that would be 7 days from the day this airs. And I can't see them not appealing. I think they will definitely appeal because for them, it's free. The lawyers that work for the board are the assistant attorney generals that are being paid by the state. So, I mean, that's another thing that you go through when you get embroiled in a case like this is the legal costs for the other side are zero, but the legal costs for your side are huge. And one of the games they play is to keep these things going as long as possible, to have it keep costing you more money, hoping at some point you'll drop out because you don't have any more money to spend on the litigation. And I just want to tell the board, we're not going to be there. You know, we're going to spend whatever it takes, and we're going to finish this case because that particular game is not going to be a winning one for the board now. This case is too important to let go. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Meryl. I mean, you've been put through, as I said at the beginning, you've been put through the ringer on this one. And it has, you know, I hope that other doctors are also not just buying into the fear that, you know, the board was trying to put out and others, but seeing your strength and standing up for what you truly believe in and for your patients.
Yeah.
So thank
I
you.
had no idea. I mean, we're now, so I was 70 when this started. I'm 75 now. Yeah, it takes a long time. And this going forward, we're looking at probably another year, maybe more. I want to live through it for sure. So I'm gonna be very healthy. I'm gonna be exercising and eating very carefully. So I want to see this through and smile at the end. And thank you.
And we want that for you too. Thank you.
The power we have is the truth.
This is the nation's leading conference.
It's so empowering to be joining together and working for our children.
Coming to CHD was the best decision that I've made probably all year.
It is a new day when senators and representatives want to associate themselves with Children's Health Defense. Why? We're telling the truth, and they know that. And because people are listening to us, and they know that.
To me, health on a political level is the most important subject. We need to raise a healthy generation.
We, the people, are waking up. We are taking back the system.
The federal government's job is not to ensure the stable legal risk for vaccine manufacturers.
Remember, we're a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I can't say it any better.
We can live to see a better day where people will be healthier and where government and corporations will be forced to be more responsible.
You can't be a decent human being and know what we have now come to learn and turn your back on it and close your eyes.
It's a great name.
That was my dad's name.
We are live and we're whispering. Okay, tell us your name.
My name is Ann Abbott.
And what's your name?
Rosalind Abbott.
And what's your dolly's name?
Riley.
Riley. Great name. Okay, let's talk about what happened. Let's go right back.
All right. Rosalind was born a very normal, wonderful baby girl. And when she was 2 years old, we started to give her vaccinations. Actually, at 1, she got her first DTaP series. Did okay. So let's move on to MMR because that's what everybody's telling us she should do. I had already chose to just do a portion of the vaccines, not the whole childhood already. Once she had her first MMR vaccine, she started to have seizures within 15 days. Now, we didn't realize she was actually having seizures right away because what we thought of seizures was going to be was like your normal tonic-clonic seizures, but she wasn't. She was having multiple different kinds. So then they just started to happen once every 6 months, They just told us that it was febrile, that she would grow out of them. I asked them about if it could be the vaccines because they said that, asked us if she had anything different happen. When we said she had her MMR, oh, that's not it. It's been too long ago. It didn't do anything to her. So we just went on living normal life. Another 6 months went by. She had another seizure, same process. Took her to the hospital. They transferred her to the local children's hospital. Is anything changed? No. Only thing we could think of was her vaccine. No, definitely not that. So let's now put her on seizure meds. So on seizure meds, okay, everything's going swell. 3 months, she starts having more seizures. They're not febrile. She's not sick. She's not, she's fine, but why is she having these seizures? This goes on, seizures progress a lot more often. She was then up to a seizure a month that we knew of, that we could visually see. So I said, okay, we need to go to a different hospital. They're not doing anything. They're just wanting to just give her medication and say she's going to grow out of it. I knew in the back of my head there was something more. We transferred down to Cincinnati Children's. They listened to us. We started within 2 months to start doing surgery testing, but they listened to us. They also, I said, could this be the vaccine? Now they did not deny or say yes it was, but they said don't do any more vaccines.
Okay, so my question: were you continuing to vaccinate after that MMR? No.
So
you had stopped, even though your questioning weren't sure.
Right.
Okay.
There was just that little mom, feeling that I had. Mm-hmm. So she went through epilepsy surgery testing to see if she was a candidate, because by then she was having 7 to 10 seizures a day. We don't know how many at night because we just didn't know. So she goes through rigorous testing. We've tried so many different seizure medications, nothing's stopping them. They've come in and tell us that she is constantly seizing on the right side of her brain, that the only way that we can stop them is to have a functional hemispherectomy, which means they were going to disconnect half of her brain to stop the seizures. So when she had that surgery that was supposed to stop them all, she was going to be fine, but it left her like a stroke patient. So her whole left side is paralyzed. She had to relearn to walk, to talk, to eat, to communicate everything. We were in there for 10 weeks, but ever since then, we have the side effects of having a hemispherectomy.
Did they tell you that this could happen during surgery? So you knew this was a possibility?
We knew it was going to be doing. We wanted to do it right away because if we waited to see what was going to happen, this would eventually have happened to her because she was diagnosed with Rasmussen's encephalitis, which is an encephalitis of one side of the brain. Very, very rare. She's about 1 in 5 billion people that have this worldwide, not just United States. So not much studies have been had about it, but trying to ask questions in that community, and a lot of people have had some form of live vaccine prior to having the condition. So anyways, she recovered from it, took a while, but she also now has gastro issues because half of her bowels work normally, half of them don't. She has hemianopsia, which is she is blind in half of both eyes, so the left side of her eyes are both blind. She has gait abnormality, she has hemiplegia, which means she can only use the right side of her body properly, the left side is weak. She, just to name a few of the other diagnoses that came from the one vaccine that ruined the rest of her life. Now, she's doing great, but after 10 years, the vaccine effect is still hitting us. She is going back to have another brain surgery because her seizures have returned. She has she's one of 5% of Hemi kids that what part they left in there because hers was a functional hemispherectomy. The temporal lobe can still communicate to the other side through the brainstem. Well, we can't remove the brainstem, so we have to go back in and take out the temporal lobe. So we're still being affected by that one choice that I made when she was 2 years old. I met a wonderful nurse while we were at Cincinnati Children's, and she had asked if, why we thought this happened, and I told her, I said, I just think it was this MMR vaccine, and she goes, I know a good lawyer. And this was a nurse that worked at Cincinnati Children's, and she gave us the name to our vaccine lawyer. I contacted him when we got home, told him our story, and he said, you definitely have a story, you definitely have a case, and I'm willing to take it. So we had already, I already contacted the Veers before that just to get the ball rolling, but I hadn't thought about a lawyer. Our lawyer fought for us for over almost 7 years. The courts finally conceded after 7 years, right before the COVID epidemic happened. But they conceded in court, and we won our case after 7 years in the vaccine courts. So.
Wow. One MMR.
One MMR, and we're still.
And so when people talk about spaced out.
Doesn't matter. I mean, she had the DTaP first. I started that at 1. Supposedly did fine. I mean, she did have that, what they quote as normal fussiness, but now that's not normal. I mean, they tell you that, but it was normal to be fussy and have low-grade fever. So then at 2, I said, okay, we'll start with the MMR. Now, our doctor, he was great. He didn't force us to. This was our new doctor, because the very first one would not spread them out. He basically fired us. So the second doctor that we found, he was a family practitioner, and he's like, it's your choice, do what you want, and he still to this day doesn't force anything on us, because he knows that, and he even testified for us for the vaccine courts. But yeah.
How long does one of these brain surgeries last?
The first hemispherectomy was a 9-hour surgery. But prior to that, she had to have internal leads placed onto her brain, which is like an EEG, but they're grids that they open the skull and put them straight onto her brain. We actually have pictures of that. And she had 150 electrodes placed onto her brain.
When did you say the next surgery is?
We haven't got it scheduled yet. We just finished. What did you just have done?
EEG, MEG, and brain ictal and ictal.
Surgery, a week-long testing for brain surgery again. So once she goes back to conference, then we'll get a more clear idea of when we'll have the surgery.
Will you let us know when she's having the surgery?
Absolutely.
And then do you like people to send cards to you? Or
yeah,
prayers and things like that?
Oh yes, prayers. That is the biggest thing. I mean, I don't ever question why it happened, but I think there was a bigger purpose for her life, and I don't like what happened, but if she can save another person's life by her story, that's what is important.
So what, apart from your beautiful doll called Riley, what kind of things do you like to do? What are your favourite things?
I'm a dancer.
You are a dancer. What kind of dancing do you do?
Ballet, tap, jazz, hip-hop, lyrical, and music theatre.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. Well, do let us know when this next one is. And what's your message to the young parent?
You can't unvaccinate. And be diligent. If you have a question, if you just aren't sure, wait. And it's not rare. It happens all the time. And those normal side effects that they tell you, that's not normal. You shouldn't just get a fever and it's normal. You shouldn't be a fussy child and it's normal. And seizures come in all shapes and sizes, and that just be vigilant. If you do decide, that is your choice, but be vigilant and know your child and know when something's not right.
Has Riley, your doll, has she got eczema? Look at that.
Looks like it.
Did she take a vaccine? Look at that.
I just sent it on her.
Absolutely not, right? No, and Rosalind is very, very strong in what she believes, and she'll, if somebody asks,
I will tell them.
What will you tell them?
I have half a brain.
From what?
from a vaccine.
You're a brave girl, really brave girl. Thank you for speaking out. Thank you, both of you.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it. And do you want to sign the bus? Yeah. Okay, let's get you a number.
This and all CHD TV programming is made possible by generous support from viewers like you. Please consider making a contribution today to keep our programming going strong. Thank you.